North Texas Congressman Colin Allred, thank you so much. You just returned from an overseas trip to Belgium and the Ukraine. And I'm wondering, what have you learned and what did you witness firsthand?
Well, I've learned that our EU and NATO allies have really never been more united against Russian aggression, and I think in support of Ukraine. And we want to make sure that this kind of fledgling democracy in Ukraine that's just getting off the ground, that I think really has a lot of promise, has a chance to become whatever they want to become, and not to have their autocratic neighbor try to change who they are or how they can be represented by invading them. We're not in 1938, 1939 anymore. This is not acceptable in Europe or anywhere around the world. And I think we're really united to make sure that doesn't happen.
So, are you more worried or less worried than before you left that Russia is going to invade Ukraine?
Yeah. Well, I think anybody who thinks they know what's going to happen here is probably not telling you the truth because this is going to come down to one person. And that person is Vladimir Putin. And for him, in many ways, this is an emotional action, an emotional decision, because he sees Ukraine as sort of the crown jewel of the former Soviet empire, if you will. And he's trying to recreate that, maybe not through actual boundaries, but at least through influence. And so that's why he has created this crisis. And I think there's a number of options that can still happen. But with this many troops built up, brought from as far away as Siberia in the Russian Federation over to this border, it does seem likely that there may be some military action. And if there is, there will be severe, severe consequences for Russia.
So, let me ask you, because the UN Security Council met today, isn't that right?
Yes,
And
it is.
and so, based on this debate, I guess that they had, what's your takeaway from that?
Well, it's clear the Russians are trying to create a pretense that it's actually the West that has been aggressive here, that it's actually Ukraine that is creating an issue here, and that anything they do will be in response to that. And this is something that we've seen the Russians do before. We're aware, for example, the British government put this out of false flag operations that the Russians were planning within Ukraine to try and create a scenario that they could then say they had to come in to respond to it. The Ukrainian security services recently, I think, captured a couple of Russian activists who were planning on doing something in Kyiv to try and create a scenario where the Russians could say they had to respond to that. So we've seen this before. We've seen this really in the World War II era with Nazi sympathizers creating incidents that then the Nazis could use as pretense for invading other countries. So it's a well-known playbook. And it's one that's not going to work here because I think the world is watching and the world is aware that this is only because of Russian aggression. This was not precipitated by any action from Ukraine or the West. This is all about Vladimir Putin.
And so, I know you had mentioned before that if Russia were to invade, that there would be severe economic sanctions. Some people have said, why not put the sanctions on now and do it as a preemptive strike? What's your thought on that?
Well, I certainly understand the reasoning behind it. If you think about it, Russia has already attacked Ukraine in many ways through cyber attacks that they're conducting right now. Just building up this level of troop build up has already impacted the Ukrainian economy. So I understand the rationale, but understand this: for a sanction regime to really hurt Russia, it has to involve the EU, it has to involve Germany, it has to involve France, it has to involve the biggest economies of the 26 states that are in the EU because they are the biggest market for the Russian gas and for other Russian products. And so without them, any sanction regime is not going to be very effective. And it's very clear from my meetings and also from what the White House has been working with our allies on that the EU members are not ready to propose any kind of preemptive sanctions, that if there's an action, they will respond, but they're not ready to go preemptively. And so for us to all go together and to have a crippling sanctions regime that will hurt Russia severely, we have to do it in a united way. So that means we're going to have to probably wait. Now, there will be some things that we can do ahead of time, and we already are doing some of those things, but any of those things will be more unilateral, maybe just involving the US, UK, and Canada, but not the full weight of the regime that would come with the EU involved.
Do you think, as it relates to fuel and the energy that you mentioned, if the US were to provide more for Europe so that they don't have to worry about Russia, and have there been any discussions about this?
Yeah. Well, this has been one of the main topics of discussion, actually, and I've been part of briefings on this for weeks now about the Biden administration's efforts working with other countries in the region, working with Middle Eastern countries like Qatar, to try and find ways to redirect, fuel to Europe to cover up for any of the losses that they'll suffer if Russia does shut off the fuel supply. And so, energy independence from Russia is incredibly important if we're going to be able to impose any kind of sanctions regime that bites. And so I'm hopeful that we can at least get the Europeans through this winter with the supplies that we're trying to bring in. And then from there, the long-term goal is going to have to be to try and separate Europe from Russia in terms of their dependence on its energy, so that we never have to face this kind of issue again, where Russia has so much leverage over their energy supplies, particularly during the winter.
But isn't there Nord Stream 2 that was just approved? I mean, in a way, I mean, that could have been prevented, no? And then this way, Europe doesn't have to worry about Putin's influence and their ability to get fuel, no?
Well, Nord Stream 2 is something that was mostly constructed during the last presidency. The Congress before I came passed sanctions to try and prevent its construction from being completed. President Trump at the time decided not to impose those sanctions. When President Biden came into office, it was 95% complete. And so it's basically has been completed, but it is not turned on. And that's really important. It is not currently providing any fuel to Germany and to the EU. And Germany has been very clear, and I'm glad that they have been, that they will not support any kind of action that if Russia does go into Ukraine, that they will not support any action to turn on Nord Stream 2. And I personally think that under any scenario, whether they invade or not, that Nord Stream 2 should never be activated because it does allow Russia to go around Ukraine, which then makes Ukraine more vulnerable to future actions like this from Russia.
Does Germany get the message?
Well, I think the German new government, and it is a new government, is in a difficult position because they have actually increased their dependence on Russian energy since the Russian invasion of 2014 into eastern Ukraine and Crimea. I think that was a mistake for them to do that previously, and I think that's partly why they're in the position they're in now. But I think maybe they've learned over the course of this crisis that you can't trust Vladimir Putin, that if you make a deal with him to provide you with energy, you give him leverage over you to prevent you from, being a part of preventing him from invading another sovereign country like Ukraine. So hopefully, going forward, having learned from this, our German allies, and they are our allies, and we have a huge troop presence there. I've visited our bases there in Germany and understand how important of an ally they are for us. Hopefully, we can work with them going forward to reduce their dependence on Russian gas and make them more energy independent.
And my last question to you, Congressman, and I appreciate your time, and that is on Ukraine. It is a NATO partner country, not a NATO member country. And so I'm wondering, what kind of impact will that have on any U.S. decision going forward to help Ukraine if they are invaded by Russia?
Yeah. Well, in my meetings with all the Ukrainian officials, and particularly the Ukrainian President Zelensky, it was very clear that they do not expect or want American boots on the ground in Ukraine. They expect to be able to fight their own battle to protect their own country. And I met some everyday Ukrainians who are very ready to do that. And I have to say, in a lot of ways, I was inspired by their sense of national identity, by their willingness to stand up and fight for their own country. But we can provide them with the tools to do that. And that's what we're doing right now. We've already provided over $650 million in military aid to Ukraine this year alone, and there's more coming. We're providing them with economic aid to keep their economy strong so that Russia is not able to destabilize them just by creating all this panic and this chaos. And so we are going to help them in every way possible. And should Russia invade, I think that you will see the Ukrainians will fight back, and that we may have a sort of resistance set up in which I don't see any scenario in which the Ukrainian people accept this lying down. And it's going to be on the rest of the world to decide how do we respond going forward from there. At this point right now, we're trying to deter Russia from invading. We're trying to give them a diplomatic off-ramp so that they will not invade. But if they do, I expect that the world will respond and that Russia will become really a pariah, that their economy, which is already lagging, will be hit very, very hard, and that Vladimir Putin's position himself as dictator will come into question.
Before we leave, I did want to acknowledge that you have tested positive for COVID. How are you feeling?
Well, I feel pretty well. I have a slight, I would call it a cold like symptoms. And I know that's because I'm fully vaccinated. I have been boosted. And I just want to encourage anyone watching this to make sure that you get vaccinated, get your booster shot. Because if you do, and you come into contact with COVID the way I did, then hopefully your symptoms will be mild like mine, instead of ending up in one of our hospitals or needing to have some treatment. And I'm thankful for that protection. And I thank you for the question, Jack.
North Texas Congressman Colin Allred, thank you so much, and you take care of yourself.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Jack.